My daughter shouted, "Get out, or I'll call police." So I called the Realtor. That's the title of my story, and it still burns in my chest every time I say it. I stood on my daughter's porch, holding proof that her husband had gambled away more than $50,000 tied to her home. Instead of listening, she raised her phone like a weapon and told me to leave, or she would call the police. At that moment, something inside me changed. I walked away without anger, without tears. I picked up my phone and dialed a different number, the Realtor. I parked at the curb and let the engine tick itself quiet. Emily's front yard looked like a magazine page. Fresh mulch, new porch lights, a wreath on the door that said home in cursive. The big screen television glowed blue through the living room window. For a moment, I just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, breathing slow. I had the papers in my jacket. Bank statements, credit lines, numbers that did not lie. I told myself to keep my voice calm and my heart steady. I walked up the path and knocked. My knuckles sounded small against the painted wood. Inside, I heard her quick steps, then the pause at the peephole. The lock clicked. The door opened only a little. "Dad," she said, "what are you doing here without calling first?" "We need to talk," I said. "It cannot wait." "About what?" "About the house." Her eyes flicked over my shoulder, like she expected someone else to be with me. "Jason is at work," she said. "If this is another lecture about his job or his car or our wedding photos, I do not want it." "It is not a lecture," I said. "It is help. Let me inside." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Fine. 10 minutes." The smell of strong candles and bacon grease hit me at once. On the coffee table were game controllers and empty cans with bright neon labels. A delivery box leaned against the wall, the tag still on the plastic. I looked at the staircase and saw the framed wedding picture halfway up. Jason's arm was tight around her shoulders. My face was not in that one. Most of them were like that. "Do you want coffee?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Please sit. I will be quick." She stopped, folded her arms, and stayed standing. "Say what you have to say." I pulled the papers from my jacket and held them out. The bank called my house by mistake. I asked for details. I did some checking. These are accounts in Jason's name tied to this address. A second mortgage. A line of credit, payments to gambling sites. It is already over 50,000. Her face went white, then red. That is not true." "It is true. Look at the dates. Look at the signatures. Look at the balances." She did not take the papers. She stared at them like they were dirty. "Where did you even get this? Did you make this up? Did you go through our mail?" I kept my voice even. "I am not your enemy. I am your father. I want you to keep this house. That is all." "He would never risk our home," she said. "He loves me." Love does not make interest stop. Love does not change how collateral works. I set the stack on the island. "Just read one page." She glanced down and then pushed the papers away with the back of her hand. They slid and fanned out across the counter. Her mouth tightened. "I cannot believe you came here to attack my husband. You have hated him since the day we got engaged." "I do not hate him," I said. "I hate what he is doing with your future." "Stop it," she said. Her voice climbed. "Stop saying our house is in danger. We pay our mortgage. We are never late. We are fine. You are fine because you do not know about the other payments. The cards, the cash advances, the fees. The rate on the line of credit jumps next month. It gets worse from there." She grabbed her phone. Her hands shook. "You cannot come in here and accuse my husband of crimes. You cannot wave papers around and scare me. You cannot control my life." I swallowed and lifted the top page. I tapped a number with my finger. "This is the balance on the second mortgage tied to this house. This is the minimum due. This is the date. I am not guessing. I am reading." Her breath came fast, and for a second I thought she might look. Then she lifted her chin. "Get out." "Emily." "Get out, Dad. Right now." I looked at my daughter. The little girl who used to sit on my lap and count the dollars as I filled out the payment stub on our old house. The teenager I taught to change a tire and check her oil. The young woman in a white dress who had asked me to walk her down the aisle even though we both knew I was already losing her. My mouth felt dry as dust. "Please," I said, softer. "Do not turn away from the truth because it hurts." She brought the phone up, close to her face like a shield. "Go away," she said, "or I will call the police." The words hung in the room. The house seemed to listen. Somewhere the fridge hummed. Outside, a car door closed on the street. My fingers wanted to curl into fists and pound the counter. My throat wanted to shout and plead. Instead, something colder slid into place inside me, like a beam finding the right pocket in the frame. "All right," I said. She blinked, thrown off by my tone. "All right, what?" "All right, I am going." I gathered the papers one by one, squared the corners, and slid them neatly back into my jacket. I looked around the living room one last time. The giant television. The gaming chair, the gray couch, the picture frames that did not have me in them. I nodded once. "I hope Jason is worth it," I said. He islanded. "I hope the house is too." I stepped out onto the porch. The winter air felt thin and clean. The wreath brushed my shoulder as the door shut behind me. I stood for a moment with the sun on my face and the anger cooling into something like resolve. Then I walked down the steps, across the perfect mulch, and back to the curb. In the cab of my truck I sat very still. I took my phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over Emily's name, but I did not press it. I scrolled instead to a different contact. Richard. I stared at that name for 3 slow breaths. Then I tapped and lifted the phone to my ear as it rang. The first sign came in a plain white envelope. I had been sorting my mail at the kitchen table when I noticed the return address from a bank I did not use. At first I thought it was junk, another offer for a credit card. Then I saw Emily's address printed across the top, and my breath caught. It was a late payment notice, not for me, but for her house. That was the moment the ground shifted under my feet. I picked up the phone, called the number on the letter, and after a lot of waiting and verifying, I heard words that made my stomach twist. The account was tied to Jason's name. Gambling charges, cash advances. A balance so large I had to ask the clerk to repeat it. I remember hanging up the phone and staring at the wall. My house felt too quiet. The refrigerator hummed. My heart beat loud in my chest. I walked into my office, pulled out a pad of paper, and started writing the numbers down. That is what I do when things spin out of control. I put them in order. By the time I was finished, I had a list of debts stacked against Emily's home like bricks ready to crush her. $53,000. Maybe more. My hand shook as I underlined the total twice. The next morning I drove across town to the construction supply company where Jason worked. I still knew some of the guys there from years ago. I asked for him at the front desk. They pointed me to the break room. He was there, leaning against the counter with a coffee mug, scrolling his phone. He looked up, surprised, then annoyed. "What are you doing here, old man?" he said. I closed the door behind me and laid the papers on the table. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About these." I spread them out, one by one. Credit statements, loan applications, online gambling charges. I watched his face as he looked at them. First blank, then a flash of red, then something like panic. He slammed his mug down so hard coffee spilled across the table. "Where the hell did you get these?" he snapped. "The bank called me by mistake," I said. "They thought it was my address. They sent me the notice. I did some digging. This is what I found." He laughed, but it sounded thin. "This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me." I leaned forward. "That house is in my daughter's name. I co-signed so she could buy it. Now it is drowning in your debts. Don't tell me it doesn't concern me." He swept the papers off the table. They scattered on the floor. "Stay out of my business, Robert. I handle my own affairs." I bent down slowly, my knees protesting, and picked up each sheet. I placed them back on the table with deliberate care. "You call this handling it. Mortgaging her home behind her back, taking out lines of credit. Does Emily even know? She knows enough, he muttered, turning away. Does she? Does she know about the second mortgage? About the home equity loan? About the applications you keep filing? I held up a printout of his latest attempt to borrow 30,000 more. He spun, tried to grab it from me, but I pulled it back. His eyes gave him away. Not just anger now, but fear. Real fear. You don't understand, he said. Then explain it to me. I have a system, he said, his voice rising. I win more than I lose. I'm about to turn it around. Your system is going to cost Emily her home. My voice was low but steady. You think I'll stand by and watch that happen? He stepped closer, his cologne mixing with the sour smell of sweat. You better back off, he said. This is between me and my wife. I held his stare. I built that equity with 30 years of overtime, 30 years of sacrifice. I will not let you burn it to the ground. The break room fell quiet. The vending machine buzzed. His jaw tightened. He jabbed a finger at me. You want to keep your nose intact, you better learn your place. Stay out. I gathered the papers, slipped them back into my jacket, and stood. My heart was racing, but my voice stayed calm. Emily will know the truth, I said. You cannot hide it forever. I walked out, his threats echoing behind me, but in my chest something colder and stronger was taking shape. The fight had only just begun. I drove to Emily's house with the papers on the passenger seat, each one stacked in the order I wanted to show her. My hands were tight on the wheel the whole way. I kept telling myself she had to see reason. She had to look at the numbers and understand. When I pulled into her driveway, I could see her car. The curtains pulled back just enough to show the big television Jason had bought. I sat for a moment breathing before I knocked on the door. She opened it wearing her scrubs, looking tired but still beautiful in the way only a daughter can look to her father. Dad, what now? She asked, her voice already wary. I held up the folder. We need to talk. Please, it's important. She sighed and stepped aside, letting me in. The living room looked like a showroom of everything new, everything flashy. Expensive speakers, a leather couch, shiny gadgets that screamed money they didn't have. I followed her into the kitchen. Bills were tucked behind a toaster, magazines piled high on the counter. She poured herself a glass of water, not looking at me. Go ahead, Dad. What is so urgent? I spread the documents across the island one by one. These are loan papers, credit reports, gambling site statements, all tied to Jason. All tied to this house. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. She laughed, but it was brittle. Where did you even get those? They're not real. They are real, I said, my voice steady. The bank sent me a notice by mistake. I checked. I confirmed. Jason has borrowed against everything, Emily. Your house, your car, even your retirement account. Her face flushed red. She shook her head. No, he wouldn't do that. He loves me. He would never risk our home. Look at the signatures, I said. Look at the amounts. This is already more than 50,000. He is drowning in debt. She slammed her glass down so hard water splashed onto the counter. Stop it. You have hated Jason since day one. You don't think he's good enough. You want me to leave him. That's what this is about. I felt something break inside me at those words. I don't care about liking him, I said quietly. I care about you keeping your home. I care about what I worked for. I helped you buy this place. I co-signed. It's not just his mess. It's your future. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't soft tears. They were sharp, angry. You made this up. You're trying to control me. You've always tried to control me. My throat tightened. Emily, why would I lie about this? Why would I invent bank records? Because you want him gone. Because you want me back under your thumb. She grabbed the papers and shoved them across the floor, scattering them everywhere. I stood there, my heart pounding, watching the little girl I had once carried on my shoulders accuse me of lies. I bent to pick them up. Each page I lifted felt heavier. Please, I said, just look at them. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize to Jason. I'll admit it. but you need to look." She covered her ears with her hands, shaking her head. "Stop it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. He loves me, Dad. That's all that matters." I stood, the papers clutched in my hands. "Emily, love doesn't pay mortgages. Love doesn't erase gambling debts. Love won't stop the bank from foreclosing." Her voice cracked as she shouted, "Get out." My heart dropped. "Emily, get out of my house right now." I looked around at the walls, at the photos where Jason stood with his arm around her, at the expensive things littered across the floor. My chest felt like stone. This house that I had worked so hard to help her get was no longer mine in her eyes. She picked up her phone and held it like a weapon. "If you don't leave, I will call the police and tell them you're harassing me." I stared at her, my daughter, the little girl who used to bring me drawings while I worked at the kitchen table. Now she looked at me like I was an intruder. Something cold washed over me then. Not anger, not sadness. Something quieter, sharper. I straightened, tucked the papers back into my jacket, and walked toward the door. She called after me. "You're trying to ruin my marriage." I stopped, my back to her. "I hope Jason is worth it," I said. "He is," she answered. "I hope the house is too." I opened the door and stepped into the evening air. My hands trembled as I walked to the truck. My chest hurt, but my face was calm. I sat behind the wheel and stared at the house that had once been a dream for both of us. Now it was sinking under Jason's lies. My daughter had chosen not to see. I turned the key in the ignition and drove away, already knowing this was not the end. When I got home that night, the house felt bigger than it had ever felt. I hung my jacket by the door, set the papers down on the counter, and stood in the quiet. My own walls seemed to lean in close, listening to the ache inside me. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because the routine steadied me. The smell rose up the way it had every morning for decades, when I dragged myself to work before the sun came up. I sat at the table and let the memories come. I saw myself at 32, kneeling on cold concrete in a half-built house, hammer in hand, driving nails until my shoulders burned. I had taken every overtime shift I could grab back then, pouring my strength into a mortgage payment we could barely manage. I remembered eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights in a row because the water heater had busted and I had to pay for a new one. I told Emily then, she was just a little girl, that when you own a home, you take care of it first. She had nodded with her gap-toothed smile like she understood. I remembered her sitting on my lap while I filled out checks at the kitchen table. She would point to the numbers and ask why I always wrote $50 more than what was due. "Because every extra dollar goes toward the principal," I explained. "That way we own the house faster." She repeated it back to me with pride. "So, it will really be ours." I kissed her forehead and told her yes, ours. Those words echo now like a cruel joke. Vacations we never took came back to me. My coworkers showed off pictures from Disney and the beach, while I showed up with sunburn lines from working outdoors on side jobs. I used the money to pay ahead on the mortgage, to keep the interest down. I missed barbecues and birthdays because I was working double shifts at the plant. I told myself it was worth it, because one day my daughter would have a place where she could feel safe, a foundation no one could take away. I remembered Christmas mornings when the tree was small, and the presents were few. Emily never seemed to mind. She hugged me and told me she loved me, and I felt like the richest man alive. I thought about the old truck I drove for nearly 15 years, patching it up with parts from the junkyard, while neighbors rolled in with new cars. Every choice I made was to keep the roof steady over our heads. Every sacrifice I swallowed was for her. Now here I was, sitting alone in the same house, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick, wondering if all that sacrifice had taught her anything. She had married a man who thought money was a toy, a man who gambled away security for the thrill of a game. She had looked me in the eye and said he would never risk her home. She had raised her phone like a weapon and told me to leave. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples, but the ache would not go. I got up and walked down the hallway to my office. On the shelves sat the old ledgers I used to keep, rows of numbers marching across the pages. Every dollar accounted for, every hour of overtime written down in neat lines. I pulled one down and flipped through it. There were the nights I worked until midnight, the weekends I spent hauling bricks, the holidays I gave up for an extra paycheck. Each line was a piece of my life traded for that house. I thought of Emily as a teenager, begging me for a new dress for prom. I'd said no at first because money was tight. Then I worked another shift and bought it for her anyway. She had cried when she saw it hanging in her closet. She told me I was the best dad in the world. Now she stood behind a man who would take all of that and gamble it away. I walked back to the kitchen and stared at the folder of documents. My hand hovered over it, and I felt something shift inside me. I was tired of being treated like an outsider in the very life I had built. I was tired of watching my sacrifices be forgotten. My daughter might choose denial, but I could not. I had given up too much. I had bled into the concrete, sweated into the wood, carried every beam of that house with my back. I sipped my coffee, bitter and black, and looked out the window at my quiet yard. I knew then that I could not simply walk away. Jason thought I was just an old man with no say, but he had forgotten one thing. I had signed my name next to hers. I had built more than walls and a roof. I had built the foundation, and a foundation holds power that the walls above it never see until they begin to crack. That night, after the memories had weighed me down, I found myself standing in front of my old filing cabinet. It sat in the corner of my office, scratched and dull, but inside it held the map of my life. I pulled open the second drawer where I kept everything related to the house. Folders stacked neatly with tabs marked taxes, insurance, mortgage. My hands trembled as I flipped through them, the paper edges biting into my fingers. Then I saw it. The original mortgage application, yellowing slightly but still crisp, my handwriting bold and careful at the bottom. Next to it was Emily's delicate script, father and daughter side by side. I carried the folder to the desk and laid it flat under the lamp. My eyes moved down the page until they landed on the section labeled co-applicant. There it was, in plain black ink. My name, Robert Turner. Not just as a guarantor, but as a co-signer, a co-owner. Joint liability, equal standing. Words I had skimmed years ago when all I cared about was making sure Emily got the house she wanted. I remembered the day so clearly now. We had sat in a bank office with its stale carpet and humming fluorescent lights. The loan officer, a woman named Margaret, had explained it in her steady, practiced voice. Jason's job history was thin, his credit shaky. Emily's salary was steady but modest. Together they couldn't reach the amount they needed. "We'll need a co-signer," Margaret had said. "Someone with strong credit to secure the loan." Emily had turned those pleading eyes on me, the same eyes that had melted me since she was a child. "Please, Dad," she whispered. "We'll never miss a payment. I promise." I should have thought longer. I should have read every word twice, but I wanted her to have her dream. So I signed. I remember Jason shifting in his chair, tapping his foot, eager to get out and start looking at furniture. He hadn't cared about the details. I had. I knew there was risk, but I convinced myself it was safe because Emily would be careful. She was her father's daughter, I thought. She knew the value of money, of ownership. Now I traced my finger over those lines. Co-applicant has equal rights in all major decisions regarding property. Refinancing, additional borrowing, sale. My breath caught. They had borrowed against the house without me. They had mortgaged my signature without my consent. That was more than betrayal. That was illegal. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. Jason thought I was powerless, just a nosy old man interfering in his marriage. Emily thought I was exaggerating, inventing papers to break them apart. But here was the truth, stamped and notarized. My name carried weight. My sacrifices were written into the foundation of that house. I sat there for a long time, the papers spread in front of me, the lamp glowing over them like a spotlight. I remembered the loan officer's words. "As co-applicant, Mr. Turner, you'll have legal standing. You'll have rights equal to the primary borrower. Back then it had sounded like a formality. Tonight it sounded like a lifeline. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I could hear the echo of my own heartbeat. My eyes stung, not from tears this time, but from the surge of clarity. I wasn't just Emily's father. I wasn't just a man with a stack of unwanted advice. I was part owner of that house. I had leverage, and leverage is something I understood. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Richard Chen's name stared back at me, the realtor who had once helped Emily with property taxes. Beneath it I added a new name, one I had written on a card years ago, Margaret's brother, a real estate attorney. My thumb hovered over the screen. Not tonight, I told myself. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, I would start making calls. I closed the folder carefully, slid it back into its place, and shut the drawer. The sound of metal sliding against metal was final, solid, like closing the door on 30 years of doubt. I stood at the window and looked out at the yard. The moonlight washed over the grass, the fence, the trees I had planted with my own hands. Everything here was mine, secure, paid for. That other house might have Jason's smell in the walls and Emily's smile in the photos, but on paper, on the foundation, my name was carved into it. For the first time since Emily had raised that phone and threatened to call the police, I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind you give when you know something no one else in the room has realized yet. Jason thought he had me cornered. Emily thought she had pushed me out. Neither of them understood what was written in black and white. They would soon. I turned off the lamp, the house falling into shadow. My body ached from the day, but my mind was awake, alive with plans. I had spent my life building things. Houses, foundations, a future for my daughter. Now I was ready to build again, not with bricks and nails, but with signatures and law. And this time I wasn't going to let anyone tear it down. It was late when the pounding started. 3 hard knocks that rattled the frame, a pause, then 3 more, louder. I set my coffee cup down and walked to the door. Through the peephole I saw Jason, his face red, his shirt wrinkled, sweat shining on his forehead. He looked like a man who had been drinking. I left the chain on and opened the door just a crack. "Evening," I said. "Open this door," he barked, pressing his palm against the frame. "It's open enough for conversation." He leaned close, his breath hot through the gap. "Lindsay told me about your little visit. She told me about your fake documents." His voice shook with anger, but there was fear under it too. "Fake," I said quietly. "Did she also tell you I know about the $53,000 in gambling debts?" He flinched. "Those aren't gambling debts, they're investments. Real estate, crypto, business ventures." Poker sites don't usually call themselves business ventures. He stepped back, then lunged forward again, like a man testing the strength of a cage. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. His eyes locked on it. "Should I call Emily? Let her hear you explain these investments." "Don't you dare," he snapped. I raised an eyebrow. "You don't want her hearing the truth." He jabbed a finger toward the gap in the door. "You've done enough damage to my marriage." "I haven't done anything," I said. "Your gambling is what's destroying it." He slammed his hand against the wood so hard the chain trembled. "It's not gambling. I have a system. I was making money until—" He cut himself off, biting his lip. "Until what?" "Until nothing. Look, you need to stay out of our business. No more surprise visits. No more waving papers around. No more poisoning Emily against me." "Or what?" His mouth twisted into something that was meant to be a smile but held no warmth. "Or things might get unpleasant for you." I studied his face through the narrow opening. His pupils were blown wide, his forehead damp. His hand tapped against his thigh in a nervous rhythm. "Are you threatening me, Jason?" "I'm explaining reality," he said, his voice dropping low. "Lonely old men living alone. Accidents happen." The words hung heavy between us. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My voice stayed level. "Interesting way to put it." He leaned even closer, the smell of cologne mixed with whiskey rolling off him. "Emily and I are happy. We're handling our finances just fine. You're not needed. You're not wanted. You're not welcome. That's your perspective, I said. It's the only one that matters. He stepped back, straightened his shirt, tried to look composed. Stay away from us, Robert. I mean it. I watched him walk to his car parked at the curb. The shiny BMW roared to life, tires squealing as he pulled away. I shut the door, slid the chain free, and threw the deadbolt. Through the front window, I saw his taillights disappear around the corner. I stood in the quiet living room for a long time, listening to the sound of my own breathing. His visit had not scared me the way he hoped it would. If anything, it told me what I needed to know. Jason was spiraling. He was desperate. He was afraid. And desperate men make mistakes. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up my coffee. It was cold now, bitter, but I drank it anyway. The taste anchored me. Jason thought he could rattle me with threats, make me back down, convince me to leave Emily in his hands. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. I had faced men like him before on construction sites. Men who promised what they couldn't deliver, who shouted and threatened when the numbers didn't add up. They all folded when the paperwork came out, when signatures and contracts replaced bravado. Jason would be no different. I went into my office and pulled out the folder again. The mortgage documents lay there waiting, my name etched alongside Emily's. I ran my fingers over the paper and felt a calm certainty settle in my chest. Jason could pound on my door, spit out threats, try to scare me with talk of accidents, but I had something stronger. I had the law. I placed the folder neatly back in its drawer, locked it, and turned off the light. The house creaked around me, old but steady, built on a foundation that had never failed. I walked down the hallway, every step measured, already thinking ahead. Jason believed he had shut me out. What he didn't know was that the real fight was only beginning. The next morning I put on my good jacket, the one I usually save for church or special dinners, and drove downtown. The sun was low, spilling gold across the windshield, but my mind was set on darker business. I had called Richard, the realtor I trusted, and asked for a meeting. His office was in a glass building overlooking the main street. Inside, it smelled of fresh coffee and printer ink. He shook my hand firmly when I walked in. "Robert," he said, "good to see you, though I take it this isn't social." "It's not." I pulled the folder from under my arm and laid it on his desk. "I need to know the current market value of this address." He opened his laptop, typed fast, pulled up charts and neighborhood comparisons. While he worked, I studied his office. Certificates on the wall, photos of him shaking hands with clients, the kind of order that reminded me of the ledgers I used to keep. After 20 minutes, he leaned back. "In this market, you're looking at 460, maybe 470 if you find the right buyer." I made notes in my pocketbook. Original purchase was 340. Mortgage balance around 293. Then I told him about the 53,000 Jason had borrowed against it. His eyes shifted, not shocked, but sharper. "So you're talking about a distressed property situation," he said. "I'm talking about a co-signer who's had enough," I replied. His eyebrows lifted. "Co-applicant rights. That changes everything. Partition by sale is a possibility. You'd need legal backing." I nodded. "I already have someone in mind." He closed his laptop and handed me a card with his direct number written on the back. "Call me when you're ready to move forward. Partition sales require careful handling, but I can get it done." I thanked him, shook his hand, and left. The elevator ride down felt heavy with decision, like I was descending deeper into something I couldn't step back from. Outside, the air smelled of car exhaust and city noise. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove a few blocks to another office, this one darker wood and brass plaques. The name on the door read, Donald Kessler, attorney at law. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, but his handshake was steady. He led me into a conference room lined with thick legal books. I spread my documents across the polished table. He adjusted his glasses and read each page with care. When he spoke, his words were precise, measured. "Partition actions aren't common in family matters," he said. Usually they come up with business partners or inheritance disputes, but the law is the same. As co-applicant, you are not just a guarantor. You are a legal co-owner. That means they cannot refinance, borrow, or sell without your consent. And since they have already violated that, you have remedies. What kind of remedies? I asked. Partition by sale. It is the nuclear option, but it works. You file, the court forces a sale. The proceeds are split according to ownership. They cannot stop it once it is filed. They can delay, they can fight, but the process moves forward. I wrote notes in neat lines as he talked. Costs, filing fees, timeframes. He explained that it could take 30 to 90 days depending on the court schedule. He warned me it would permanently damage my relationship with Emily. That relationship is already damaged, I said quietly. She threatened to call the police on me. Jason showed up at my door with threats of his own. They gambled away what I built. The damage is done. He nodded slowly. Then the decision is clear. We'll begin paperwork Monday morning. I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief, like pouring a foundation. You know the work is hard, but once it's poured, it's set. You cannot undo it. I shook his hand, thanked him, and walked back out into the daylight. Driving home, the traffic crawled. My mind raced ahead anyway, lining up each step like a construction project. Foundation, research, permits, materials. Only this time the material was legal documents. This time the foundation was my forgotten signature. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was dark. I carried the folder inside, placed it on my desk, and stared at it under the lamp. My name, written years ago to help my daughter's dream, was now the very thing that could end that dream. I ran my hand over the paper and felt the weight of it settle in me. Jason thought he could scare me into silence. Emily thought she could dismiss me as meddling. They had both forgotten that the house stood on more than love and lies. It stood on my name. I turned off the lamp and sat in the quiet. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. The groundwork was laid. The fight was moving out of kitchens and break rooms and into the courtroom, a place where words like joint liability and co-owner carried more power than Jason's threats ever could. The papers went out on a Thursday morning. I knew because Donald called me from the courthouse parking lot. The clerk stamped everything and the sheriff's office was assigned service. By law, both Emily and Jason would be handed copies. It was no longer a family argument. It was now a case with a number, stamped and sealed. I spent that afternoon trimming the citrus trees in my yard. The sun was warm on my neck, but my hands shook every time I thought about what was happening across town. I pictured a deputy walking up to Emily's door, handing over an envelope with her name on it. I imagined her confusion, the way her brow would furrow as she tore it open. I imagined Jason snatching it from her, his voice rising, his face red. The first call came just before dinner. Emily's name lit up my phone. I let it ring. When it went to voicemail, I heard her voice crack with panic. "Dad, please call me back. We got some papers today. I don't understand what's happening. Please." I saved it, set the phone down, and kept eating. An hour later, Jason called. His voice was hard and fast. "What kind of game are you playing, old man? You think you can scare us with legal papers? This is family business, not some courtroom drama." I listened, then deleted it. By the time I went to bed, I had 6 missed calls and 3 more voicemails. Emily again, crying this time. "Dad, Austin says you're trying to steal our house. That can't be true. Tell me it's not true." My chest hurt hearing her plead, but I didn't pick up. I had begged her to listen before, and she refused. Now the law was speaking for me. Friday morning, the messages kept coming. Jason's tone had shifted to anger. "You're making a big mistake, bigger than you realize. You'll regret this." Emily's messages were longer, filled with questions. "Why are you doing this? Don't you love me anymore? Can't we work it out?" She kept saying the word family, like it was a shield. But family had meant nothing when she raised her phone and told me to get out. I forwarded the threats to Donald. "Standard reaction," he said. "First denial, then panic, then anger. What matters is that they've been served. The clock is running." They have 30 days to respond. That weekend, I kept myself busy. I cleaned out the garage, raked leaves, washed the truck. The phone buzzed on the workbench every hour, but I didn't answer. My neighbor waved at me over the fence and asked if everything was all right. I smiled and said fine. I didn't tell her that my daughter thought I was stealing her house, that my son-in-law was leaving threats on my voicemail. Some things are too heavy to share with neighbors. Sunday night, I sat in my recliner and listened to one last voicemail from Emily. Her voice was flat, tired. "Dad, I don't know who you are anymore. You're tearing this family apart. If you go through with this, I will never forgive you." I closed my eyes, holding the phone to my ear. She had no idea what Jason had already done to tear us apart. On Monday, Donald called to confirm the service had been logged. Both defendants had signed the papers. He sounded calm, professional. "Now we wait," he said. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Waiting was something I knew how to do. I had waited out mortgages, waited out layoffs, waited through long nights of overtime. I could wait 30 days. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open. The documents were lined up in neat rows. The sheriff's return of service clipped on top. My name sat there beside Emily's again, as if reminding me I wasn't a ghost in this fight. I was a co-owner, a man with standing. Jason's threats were just noise against the weight of a stamped seal. Outside my window, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone else is settling down to dinner. I wondered if across town Emily was pushing food around her plate, refusing to meet Jason's eyes, the envelope still sitting on the counter between them. I wondered if Jason was already plotting some new way to twist the truth. But whatever they felt, whatever they planned, the papers were in their hands now. I turned off my phone, slid the documents back into their folder, and went to bed early. My house creaked as the wind shifted outside, but the foundation held firm. The fight had left kitchens and break rooms and front porches. It was now moving through the courthouse halls, guided by signatures and deadlines. Jason had told me accidents happened to lonely old men, but now he was the one standing on shaky ground, and the law was the storm that would bring his house down. The days after the papers were served stretched long and heavy. At first, the phone never stopped ringing. Emily begging, Jason shouting, both of them switching from anger to fear in the space of an hour. Then suddenly it went quiet. No calls, no texts, just silence. It was almost worse than the noise. I knew it wasn't over. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm when the air grows too still and the birds disappear. Donald told me they hadn't filed any response. He said that was common when people thought they could bluff their way out, pretend the law didn't apply to them. The court clock was ticking, though, and every day that passed without a filing was a day closer to judgment. I kept that thought in the front of my mind, even as the quiet pressed in on me. I followed his advice and moved out of my house for a while. He said Jason's threats worried him, and he didn't like the idea of me staying in the same place where they knew they could find me. I hated the thought of leaving my home, but I packed 3 suitcases, locked up tight, and rented a small apartment near downtown. The building wasn't much to look at, but it had security doors and a manager who minded her own business. I carried in only what I needed: clothes, toiletries, and the box of legal documents. Everything else I left behind. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and old carpet. The furniture was plain and had no history attached to it. At first it felt strange, like I was living in someone else's life, but after a few nights, I began to appreciate the quiet. No one knew I was there except Richard and Donald, and both of them had promised confidentiality. For the first time in weeks, I could sit without waiting for pounding on my door or my phone lighting up with threats. Still, the silence carried weight. I found myself pacing in the evenings, checking the courthouse docket online, rereading the same documents over and over. I watered the small plant the manager had left on the counter, and I thought of my garden back home, the citrus trees I had pruned with care. I wondered if Jason ever looked at them when he drove by, if he even noticed the work it had taken to make them bear fruit. A few times I drove past my own street, slowing just enough to see. My mailbox sat empty, the curtains drawn tight. Once I saw a car I didn't recognize parked in front of my driveway. I didn't stop. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. I reminded myself that the house was locked, that I had neighbors who would call me if anything happened. But the image of Jason standing on my porch with his fists clenched lingered. On the 10th day, a note appeared under my old front door. My neighbor called me and told me she had seen Emily sitting on the porch for nearly an hour. When I drove by that evening, I found the folded paper waiting. I brought it back to the apartment and opened it. Her handwriting was shaky. "Dad, I know you're avoiding us, but we're running out of time. We found an apartment, but we can't get approved because of Jason's credit. We need help with deposits. Please just talk to me." She signed it. "Your daughter, Emily," as if the reminder of blood would change the ink on a court filing. I folded it, filed it with the rest of the documents. The words hurt, but they didn't change what had already been done. Love had not stopped Jason from gambling. Pleading had not stopped him from lying. My warnings had not stopped Emily from turning me out of her home. Only the law had power left. At night, I lay in the strange bed and listened to the sounds of the apartment complex, footsteps in the hallway, a distant television, the muffled slam of car doors in the parking lot. I told myself this was temporary, just a holding pattern while the machinery of justice did its work. But a small voice whispered that maybe this was my new life now, that once the storm passed, there would be nothing left standing between me and my daughter but ashes. Still, I held on. I woke each morning, brewed coffee in the small pot the apartment provided, and looked out the window at the courthouse clock tower just 6 blocks away. Its hands moved steady, patient, like a carpenter measuring cuts on lumber. Each tick brought me closer to resolution. Emily and Jason could fill the silence with denial if they wanted, but the storm was coming, and when it broke, it would sweep away everything they thought was safe. The day the court order came through, I was sitting at the small table in my apartment with a cup of black coffee. Donald called and said it plainly. The judge signed off on the partition by sale. The property will be listed within the week. I wrote the date down in my notebook, the same way I used to mark mortgage payments years ago. Only this time it wasn't a payment. It was the beginning of the end. Richard called a day later to confirm the appraisal. $437,000. He said buyers would come fast, especially cash buyers looking for quick deals. I could hear the shuffle of papers on his desk as he spoke, steady and professional. He asked if I wanted to see the listing photos once they were taken. I told him yes. That evening, an email arrived with bright images of Emily's living room, Jason's gaming setup pushed into a corner, the kitchen counters cleared of clutter, the bedrooms staged with neutral bedding. Their home had been stripped of personal marks and turned into a commodity. I studied each picture carefully. The same walls that once held Emily's smile, the same staircase I helped her climb when she was little, now photographed like a model house for strangers. It hurt, but it also felt just. They had treated that place like a toy, something to leverage and gamble with. Now the house would be sold to someone who might value it the way a home should be valued. The showing started immediately. Richard updated me by phone. 2 cash buyers came the first afternoon, both interested, both asking about closing timelines. An investment group came the next day. The market was hot, he said, and the forced sale price made it even more attractive. I nodded as I listened, picturing Emily standing by the window, watching strangers walk through her kitchen and open her closets. Jason must have hated it. His pride paraded in front of neighbors who now knew everything. The calls from Emily began again. Her voice was raw, pleading. "Dad, please, we can fix this. Jason is looking for another job. We can make payments. Don't let them take our house." Each message pulled at me, but I stayed silent. She had called the house her own when she ordered me out. She had lifted her phone like a weapon when I tried to warn her. Now the house was showing her who really held the power. Jason's messages turned bitter. "You think you've won, old man. You won't see a dime from this. We'll fight it. We'll find a way." But I could hear the cracks in his voice. The swagger was gone, replaced with the panic of a man losing his grip. One evening I drove past their street. A white sign stood in the yard, bold letters announcing for sale. Below it hung a rider that read, "Court ordered." Neighbors were outside, whispering to each other, some pointing at the house. I slowed just enough to take it in before driving on. My hands tightened on the wheel, not from regret, but from the weight of 30 years settling into one sign hammered into the ground. Offers came within the week. Richard called to say a buyer was ready to close in 30 days, cash in hand. The number was $425,000. After fees, debts, and commissions, I would clear around $78,000. Not a fortune, but enough to feel that justice had been served. Enough to remind me that sacrifices made years ago still had value. Emily left one more note at my old house. My neighbor called to tell me she had sat there crying before slipping it under the door. I picked it up later that evening. Her words were shaky, full of desperation. "Dad, we found an apartment, but we can't cover the deposits. Please, just talk to me. We'll be homeless in 3 weeks." I folded it and placed it with the other documents. It was part of the record now, evidence of choices made and consequences faced. As the closing date drew closer, the silence returned. No more calls, no more threats, just the slow grinding of the process. I spent my days tending the small plant in the apartment, walking to the courthouse library, and waiting. The storm had passed, but it had taken their roof with it. Soon it would take their walls and floors too. The morning, Richard called with the final date. I wrote it in my notebook with careful letters. March 28th, closing day. By then, Emily and Jason would be gone, the house emptied, the keys handed over, and I would sit in a conference room and watch the years of sacrifice I had poured into that house turn into a check with my name on it. The sale wasn't just about money. It was about truth. It was about proving that love without responsibility is just noise. It was about reminding them that a foundation cannot be ignored. And as the day drew near, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. The house would be sold. Justice would be written in ink and stamped with a seal. And I would walk away knowing I had built something stronger than walls, stronger than memories. I had built a stand, and I had not bent. The morning of the walkthrough came with a sharp wind and gray skies. I woke early, drank my coffee in silence, and sat for a long time staring at the courthouse clock tower through my apartment window. I thought about the years that had led to this day, the sacrifices etched into every payment, every late-night shift, every dollar I had pushed toward a mortgage that wasn't even mine. Now it was all boiling down to one last inspection, one final look before the keys changed hands. I didn't plan to attend. Richard had assured me it wasn't necessary, that the buyer and their inspector would walk through the property with him present. Still, I drove by the neighborhood. I parked a block away, out of sight, and watched. A moving truck stood in the driveway. The once proud wreath was gone from the front door, replaced by strips of packing tape. Curtains were pulled back, boxes stacked inside. I saw Jason carrying a heavy box down the porch steps, his shoulders hunched. Emily followed with a smaller one, her hair tied back, her face pale even at a distance. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering behind their hands. I recognized some of them, folks who had once congratulated Emily on buying her dream home, now shaking their heads at how quickly dreams crumble when built on lies. I sat in my truck and watched as furniture was carried out piece by piece. The big screen television, the leather couch, the flashy gadgets Jason had bought to impress. All loaded into a truck that looked too small for everything they had stuffed into that house. At one point, Emily paused on the porch, looking out across the street. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. For a moment she looked like the little girl who once stood in our old yard with chalk on her hands, asking me to draw houses with her. But then Jason barked something from inside, and she disappeared back through the door. I felt a tug in my chest, but I stayed put. Richard arrived with the buyer, a middle-aged woman in a neat suit carrying a clipboard. They walked through the yard, noting small details, pointing at the roofline, the gutters, the fresh mulch Emily had once been so proud of. The buyer nodded, satisfied. Richard shook her hand, smiling his professional smile. The house had shifted from home to asset, from memory to contract. That was what the law did. It stripped away emotion until only the truth remained. I stayed in my truck, unseen. I didn't want Emily to know I was there. This wasn't a moment for reunion or apologies. It was business, the final act of a long battle. I had no intention of walking into that house again, not after the way she had ordered me out, not after she lifted her phone and threatened me with the police. Some doors once closed are never meant to open again. The moving truck door slammed shut. Jason climbed into the cab, slammed the steering wheel with both fists before starting the engine. Emily followed slowly, glancing once more at the porch, the yard, the neighbors. I thought maybe she was searching for me, maybe hoping I'd appear. I didn't. The truck rumbled away, leaving behind an empty house and a sign in the yard that told the whole story in bold letters. For sale. Court ordered. I let out a long breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The storm was nearly over. They were gone. The buyers were stepping in, and the house was no longer a battleground. It was simply a property waiting for signatures. As I drove back to my apartment, I thought about the years of overtime, the peanut butter dinners, the vacations never taken. I thought about the nights Emily had sat on my lap as I filled out checks, asking why I always paid more. I wondered if those lessons still lingered in her memory, or if they had been buried under Jason's promises. Maybe one day she would remember. Maybe one day she would see that I hadn't destroyed her life. I had simply refused to let her husband destroy mine. That night I sat at my small kitchen table, the folder of documents in front of me. I didn't even open it. I just rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of paper that had carried me through. Tomorrow would be the closing. Tomorrow my name would be written on a check instead of hidden in the fine print of a mortgage. Tomorrow the house would no longer be hers or his or mine. It would belong to strangers. The final walkthrough had come and gone. The chapter was almost closed. I sat in the quiet of my apartment and let the truth settle in. Sometimes justice doesn't look like victory. Sometimes it looks like boxes carried out of a house, a sign planted in a yard, and a father watching from the distance while the family he built walks away. The closing took place in a plain conference room with buzzing fluorescent lights and a long table that smelled faintly of polish. I sat at one end with Donald beside me, his briefcase open and neat, while Richard laid out the final documents. Across from us sat the buyer's attorney, calm and efficient, sliding papers into stacks for signatures. There was no shouting here, no pleading, no slammed doors. Only pens scratching on paper and the quiet authority of the law. When the check slid across the table toward me, my hand hesitated. For a moment I thought of Emily, at 7 years old, tracing mortgage numbers with her small finger, asking why I always paid more. I thought of the water heater that broke the summer she wanted to go to Disney, the long nights at the concrete plant, the Christmas mornings when I told her love was worth more than presents. Then I picked up the pen and signed. The numbers on the check were not enormous, but they were solid, real, earned through both sacrifice and perseverance. Donald closed his briefcase with a click. "Justice served," he said simply. Richard shook my hand with the firm grip of a man who knew the work was done. I walked out of the building with the spring wind against my face, my jacket flapping lightly, and a weight that had pressed on me for months finally lifting. Back at my apartment, I laid the check on the table and stared at it. $78,437. Money that represented 30 years of sacrifice and weeks of pain turned into a sum I could use to start again. I didn't cry, though the urge pressed at me. Instead, I brewed a pot of coffee, black and strong, and sat in silence while the courthouse clock tower outside struck noon. That evening I listened to a voicemail from Emily. Her voice was softer, worn down. "Dad, we moved out yesterday. Jason got a job in Jacksonville. I understand now about the money, about why you did what you did. I'm sorry it took losing the house for me to see it. I love you. Please forgive us." I let the message play twice before deleting it. Forgiveness was not a matter of voicemail. Understanding was not the same as respect. She had chosen Jason's lies over my truth until the law forced her eyes open. Some wounds take more than apologies to close. In the days that followed, I toured new places to live. I found a condominium in a quiet community by a golf course. The buildings were modest, the lawns neat, the neighbors retired teachers and engineers who talked about weather and grandkids instead of debts and drama. When the sales agent told me most owners here had saved carefully and valued stability, I felt something in me settle. These were my people, the ones who understood that security was built day by day, dollar by dollar, with no shortcuts. I signed an offer on a corner unit with a small balcony that looked out over green grass and trees. When I stepped inside for the first time, sunlight poured across the carpet, filling the space with warmth. There were no memories clinging to these walls, no shadows of arguments or threats. It was clean, ready for me to build a new chapter. The move was simple. A few suitcases, a box of legal files, and the furniture I chose carefully from what I had left. I hung one picture of Emily on the wall, her graduation photo, a reminder of both pride and heartbreak. Not to torture myself, but to keep the lesson sharp. Love without respect is fragile. Sacrifice without gratitude is wasted. But boundaries backed by law are strong enough to stand. Each morning I brewed coffee in my new kitchen, opened the balcony door, and listened to the sound of golfers calling to one another in the distance. My hands no longer trembled when I poured my cup. I no longer jumped when the phone rang. I was no longer the man pacing in a rented apartment waiting for threats to arrive. I was a man who had fought for what he built and come through with something left in his hands. Jason and Emily were gone, chasing another beginning in a city that would not know their past. Perhaps they would rebuild. Perhaps they would not. That was no longer mine to carry. My job was finished. Justice had been served through paper and signatures, not fists or shouting. Renewal had come not from reconciliation, but from drawing a line and refusing to let anyone cross it. One evening, as the sun set red over the golf course, I sat on my balcony with a glass of water, watching the shadows stretch long. I thought of the foundation I had poured with my own hands years ago, and the foundation I had rediscovered in my forgotten signature. Both had held. Both had proven stronger than storms. I smiled, not a bitter smile, but one of quiet satisfaction. The house was gone, but I remained, steady on solid ground, ready for whatever life decided to build next. In the end, justice was not loud, it was steady. I had spent 30 years pouring my strength into a foundation I thought would protect my daughter. Jason gambled it away, and Emily turned me out, but the law gave me back both dignity and peace. The house was sold, the debts erased, and I walked forward with money in my hands and lessons in my heart. Renewal came when I chose respect for myself over pleading for theirs. What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.